Humankind's oldest written story is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which dates back some 5,000 years. One of the key characters of that story is Enkidu, the wild man. Enkidu was described as living among the beasts, and not much more than a beast himself, with long, flowing hair and grazing upon grass like the gazelles. He was also creating his share of problems for the hunters of his animal friends, so Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, sends a prostitute to Enkidu who beds him and civilizes him. Eventually, the two fight man to man, exhausting each other and becoming friends, an old trope of guys who punch for a bit before teaming up. But the remaining story has a pervasive sense of loss that Enkidu gained much by becoming civilized, but still lost the freedom of his wildness. This story, like all great myths, has lasted because it resonates deeply on so many levels. It can be read as a metaphor for life, the wildness of childhood, sexual awakening and loss of virginity, and assumption into adulthood and everything that comes with it. It can be understood as a metaphor for consciousness, the emergence from id to ego and superego. And it can be understood as a metaphor for society, the evolution of life in a state of nature to organized civilization with all the complexities that entails. And throughout time, storytellers and philosophers have grappled with this concept. To some, it was a necessary evolution from savagery and violence to law and order. To others, it was a descent from Arcadian utopia into the savagery and violence of civilization. On and on we have told and retold the story of the wild man, in different times and with different names. One of the most popular of those names over the last century has been Tarzan the Ape Man. Almost immediately from publication in 1912, this story of a boy from civilization, lost on the coast of Africa and living among the beasts, and falling in love with a woman from civilization, captured the attention of Hollywood. Tarzan novels have been published at a rate of one a year between 1912 and 1916, and the first Tarzan movie was released in 1918, starring Elmo Lincoln in the starring role. Thereafter, Tarzan became one of the most frequently adapted characters in cinema history, only falling short of Sherlock Holmes and Dracula. Despite the plethora of versions of Tarzan, including a Disney cartoon, none have been as iconic or definitive as Johnny Weissmuller's through Hollywood's golden age. The former Olympic swimmer turned actor is virtually synonymous with the character. It may even be said that his version eclipses Edgar Rice Burroughs' literary original. The famous call and Tarzan's savage inability to string together a full sentence are creations of Metro Goldwyn Mayer. MGM's 1932 version of Tarzan the Ape Man was originally a response to their box office success of the previous year, Trader Horn. Though based ostensibly on the life of ivory trader Alfred Aloysius Horn, the film version of his life owes more to Sir H. Rider Haggard's She Who Must Be Obeyed, in which a lost white woman is treated as a god by the natives she rules over. The public clamored for more, and MGM supplied with an advertising gimmick that seems almost unbelievable today. Where modern movies may be cynically decried as copies of last year's hit, MGM's Tarzan the Ape Man was actually advertised as being the Trader Horn of 1932. Beyond the action and plot, the first of the Weissmuller Tarzan films is a visual feast. Much of the screen time is taken up by stock footage, mostly left over from Trader Horn's cutting room floor, featuring scenes of African savanna wildlife and native tribes. Trader Horn was, in fact, the first fictional, non-documentary film shot on location in Africa. Tarzan the Ape Man's story revolves around British trader James Parker, played by C. Aubrey Smith, and his right-hand man, Harry Holt, played by Neil Hamilton, embarking on a risky safari to find the legendary Elephant's Graveyard and a king's ransom in ivory. Along on their adventure is Jane, played by Marina Sullivan, daughter of Mr. Parker and the apple of Harry's eye. But when they reach the forbidding Mutia Escarpment, a vast plateau which the superstitious natives refuse to climb, Harry finds a new competitor for Jane's affections in the form of the mysterious Tarzan. From there, mortal combat with savage lions and crocodiles, battle with ferocious pygmies, pit fighting with a bloodthirsty ape, and a great elephant stampede ensues. Even the passing fan of Tarzan's literary adventures will notice that Tarzan the Ape Man has almost no relation to the book it is based on. Unlike most cases, this was actually by design. Having dealt with unsatisfactory adaptations before, Edgar Rice Burroughs licensed the Tarzan characters but not the rights to the story. The creative personalities behind the MGM films were forced to come up with a wholly original idea, purposely avoiding legally entangling similarities to the original novels. And this is where Sol Lesser comes into the story. A pioneering film producer, Lesser purchased competing rights to Tarzan from another bankrupted producer. When MGM found out, they actually paid Lesser off to delay his film until their own had been released. The result, for Lesser, was the 12-episode serial Tarzan the Fearless in 1933, starring the future Flash Gordon, Buster Crabbe. The serial was an embarrassment for MGM and Burroughs, but the latter and Sol Lesser would go on to become fast friends. Burroughs licensed Tarzan to Lesser for a 5-film deal, but the only one he actually made was Tarzan's Revenge for 20th Century Fox in 1938. Keep Lesser in mind, however. Burroughs made his own serial in 1935, The New Adventures of Tarzan, which is much more accurate to the character in the novels. The success of Tarzan the Ape Man easily overtook that of the film it was a conceptual follow-up to, and competing versions of Tarzan. So much so that most people have never heard of Trader Horn or the other Tarzan films. However, by the time the sequel, Tarzan and His Mate, came in 1934, the bar for adventure films had been raised and never yet truly surpassed. 1933's King Kong forced Tarzan and His Mate to be an even bigger, grander, more sublime, and more ambitious story. For the most part, it worked. By most reckonings, this is one of the few cases where the sequel is considered superior to the original. And what is especially fascinating about them is their inversion of the classic wild man archetype. Even in the novels, Tarzan is the main character, and we see his struggles with and against civilization through his own eyes. Not so in the MGM films, which had to contractually distance themselves from the novels. Tarzan and Harry represent opposite poles on Jane. She is actually the main character. Tarzan is a mysterious and beguiling other. Not even his origin is explained. Whereas the lure of sex drew Enkidu into civilization, it drew Jane out of it. Tarzan represents wildness, freedom, adventure, and sexual liberation. Well, he did until the Hays Code cracked down on it. At this point, the Tarzan series begins to echo the development of other great movie franchises of the 1930s and 40s. In particular, the similarities to Universal's Frankenstein series are almost frightening. Both feature an excellent opening film, an even better sequel, but begin a decline with their third film, falling ever further into mediocrity with each new installment. This isn't to say they are bad per se, it's quite fun mediocrity, but both series manage to veer away from the daring territory of their initial installments and lose what made them most interesting. The main appeal of the Tarzan myth is the idea of life in a romantic, idealized state of nature, escaping the pressures of civilization to live a more free and authentic life, contesting yourself against the elements of nature in an Edenic paradise of social, economic, and even sexual liberation. When Jane left her world behind to live in Tarzan's, it was for that very purpose. But by Tarzan Escapes in 1936, Tarzan's world began to look very much like the civilization she left, down to her thong bikini being replaced by a demure one-piece, and the Swiss Family Robinson-style tiki treehouse they come to occupy. Jane describes her home to her visiting relatives in Tarzan Escapes as having all the modern conveniences, including hot and cold running water, elevators, a rotating spit, dishwasher, gazebo, and sit-down formal table with utensils. The free life of the jungle has become settled and domestic. 1939 heralded another event that confirmed the domesticity of Tarzan, when Tarzan finds a son. Since Tarzan and Jane weren't formally married by 1930 standards, they were forced to recover an infant, the sole survivor of a plane crash on the escarpment, rather than, make one of their own. In doing so, they dive firmly into the wholesome family fare that eluded them in the early days of non-Hays approved nudity and jungle violence. Tarzan only had 2 more adventures under the MGM banner: Tarzan's Secret Treasure in 1941 and Tarzan's New York Adventure in 1942. In the latter, a haphazard fish-out-of-water comedy, The line between jungle and civilization is thoroughly blurred. Ultimately, while Tarzan and family prefer the wilds of Africa, Tarzan eventually affirms that the laws of civilization are good, and all the friends he met in New York are ready to venture to the once elusive and dangerous escarpment to fish and honeymoon. With Tarzan's New York adventure, the series had run its course at MGM, and this is where Sol Lesser steps back into the picture. He never lost his interest in Tarzan, so when MGM dropped the license, Lesser was there to pick it back up, along with the contracts of Weissmuller and Johnny Sheffield, who played Tarzan's adopted son. Marina Sullivan opted not to continue with the series, ending the initial duo of Tarzan and Jane. To make the films, Lesser turned to RKO Radio Pictures. At this point, RKO was restructuring itself to produce primarily cheap B-movies, and the trajectory already established by the late MGM films would serve them well. Unable to get over the loss of O'Sullivan, Jane was absent during 1943's Tarzan Triumphs and Tarzan's Desert Mystery. While RKO set to work recasting the parts, and probably holding out hope that O'Sullivan could be induced to return, the character of Jane was off in England, helping the war effort. The series no longer lived in the vagaries of Hollywood's golden age, like Old Frankenstein, but rather it became fully entrenched in World War II. Tarzan Triumphs even deals thematically with the question of wartime neutrality, as Tarzan tries to stay out of the conflict. Inevitably, Tarzan must combat the Nazis, who invaded the jungle in both pictures. A Burroughs-esque element of science fiction is even thrown into the mix when stock footage from 1 million BC is spliced into Desert Mystery. Even discounting the war, this once untamed paradise known only to Tarzan, Jane, and a handful of pygmies and cannibals becomes downright cosmopolitan. There are several different arabesque cities dotting the former Mutia escarpment, and at least one lost empire of warrior women in 1945's Tarzan and the Amazons. This ancient city, forbidden to men, is introduced by Tarzan when he escorts an escaping Amazon back to her home. Luckily, the matriarch, played by the Wolfman's Maria Uspenskaya, knows Tarzan and trusts that he will not reveal the location of the city. Unfortunately, Tarzan's son trailed his adoptive father and proceeds to lead a ruthless gang of treasure hunters right to it. Jane also makes her less than triumphant return, played by Brenda Joyce. Unlike the distinctive and beautiful Marina Sullivan, Joyce is a very drab 1940s B-movie heroine. A blonde, fairly average, nondescript housewife who really adds nothing to the movie and has no chemistry with Weissmuller whatsoever. From here on, Jane isn't really an active player either. She's just sort of there, a set dressing, because after all, Tarzan requires a Jane, right? The series' perspective has completely shifted to Tarzan himself as the main character, trying to maintain some semblance of wild simplicity in an increasingly domesticated and civilized world. The next two films, 1946's Tarzan and the Leopard Woman and 1947's Tarzan and the Huntress, are pretty much expendable, as the late MGM pictures were. The former deals with a violent leopard-based cult, and the latter has an extended theme on the ethics of capturing wild animals for zoos, a practice that has long since ended. Weissmuller's final Tarzan film was Tarzan and the Mermaids, and marks the most significant departure from any previous Tarzan film. In fact, this 1948 offering is much more in line with the typical golden age of Hollywood variety picture. Weissmuller, no longer his younger and svelter self from 15 years prior, takes up much less screen time in favor of musical numbers and synchronized diving performances. Gone is the pretense that Tarzan's home is a remote jungle locked away on the forbidding Mutia escarpment. The escarpment seems to have symbolically disintegrated and is absent from a map shown at the beginning of the film. Instead, Tarzan's treehouse is just downstream from the settlement of Nyaga, and the river between them is described as gentle and peaceful. Downstream of Tarzan's home is a newer, more inhospitable, and more difficult to reach lost civilization of Aquitania. Like in Tarzan and the Amazons, Tarzan's jungle has become so cosmopolitan that even more remote regions must be found. Not only is the content of the film a departure from prior Tarzan films, but so is the aesthetic. Tarzan's previous forbidden jungle of tangled foliage and winding rivers has been replaced by palm trees and rocky coastlines. The ancient temples of Aquitania have a distinctively Mayan flavor, and that all makes sense given that the film was shot on location in Acapulco, Mexico, a first for the series. Overall, there is a more decidedly Pacific Island vibe, overlapping with sarong pictures and the emergence of tiki culture. The plot is only one step removed from the girl in the volcano trope. This time is the girl betrothed to a tiki god. Combined with Tarzan's bamboo and thatched treehouse, Aquitania is a Polynesian pop paradise, just shy of having wooden tiki gods, mai tais, and paper umbrellas. In 1948, after an astonishing 12 films, Weissmuller traded in Tarzan's loincloth for Jungle Jim's pith helmet. From 1948 to 1955, he would star in 16 Jungle Jim films for Columbia, while enduring public derision for his middle-aged physique. Johnny Sheffield, now well and truly past puberty, also moved on, starring as Bomba the Jungle Boy for Allied Artists from 1949 to 1955. Lesser and RKO weren't done with Tarzan, though. After Weissmuller, the mantle was passed to RKO contract player Lex Barker. Finally, they found a Tarzan as generic and uncharismatic as Brenda Joyce's Jane. He would star in 5 Tarzan films altogether, from 1949 to 1953: Tarzan's Magic Fountain, Tarzan and the Slave Girl, Tarzan's Peril, Tarzan Savage Fury, and Tarzan and the She-Devil. In the first of those, Brenda Joyce maintained some continuity by playing Jane, but thereafter the Jane was different in every film. RKO's last Tarzan film was Tarzan's Hidden Jungle in 1957, starring George Scott. Thereafter, Sol Lesser and George Scott took Tarzan back to MGM, and RKO didn't even exist anymore. Tarzan served his use for RKO for a time, providing over a decade of jungle adventure B-movies. But Tarzan wasn't the only two-fisted pulp hero to be adapted into B-movies by RKO. The urban jungle can be even more dangerous than the wild one, and nobody knew that better than the subject of our next installment, the great comic strip detective turned B-movie noir star, Dick Tracy.